The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground, as 282 soldiers stood in perfect formation. Their boots gleamed, their uniforms pressed to perfection, and their eyes fixed straight ahead. It was inspection day at Fort Harrison, and everyone knew what that meant. Colonel Marcus Webb would be making his rounds, looking for any excuse to demonstrate his authority. Sarah Chen had been dreading this day for weeks. As the only female combat instructor at the base, she already faced enough challenges without having to deal with Webb's notorious temper. The other soldiers respected her skills. But Webb made it clear he believed women had no place in military combat training. Webb was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed to stretch forever. His gray mustache twitched when he was angry, which was most of the time. He had served in 3 wars and earned more medals than most soldiers could count. But his old-fashioned views about women in the military made him a difficult superior for someone like Sarah. Sarah was different from what people expected when they heard about a female combat instructor. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with lean muscles built from years of martial arts training that began when she was just 7 years old. Her father had been a karate master, and her mother practiced Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Growing up in their dojo, Sarah learned that size meant nothing if you understood leverage, timing, and technique. The inspection began like always. Webb walked slowly down the line of soldiers, his sharp eyes searching for any imperfection. A scuffed boot here, a wrinkled collar there. When he found something wrong, he would stop and lecture the entire group about military standards and discipline. Sarah watched from her position near the obstacle course. She was supposed to demonstrate advanced defensive techniques after the inspection ended. Her stomach churned as she saw Webb approaching her section of the training ground. She knew he would find something to criticize about her program. "Attention!" Webb's voice boomed across the field. The soldiers snapped to an even straighter posture, if that was possible. Webb continued his slow march, his boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. When he reached Sarah's area, Webb stopped and turned to face the assembled troops. His face wore the expression Sarah had learned to fear, the look that meant he was about to make an example of someone. "Soldiers," Webb began, his voice carrying across the silent field. "Today we're going to discuss what happens when military standards are lowered to accommodate political correctness." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She knew what was coming, but she forced herself to remain professional. The other instructors had warned her about Webb's tendency to use inspection day as a platform for his personal opinions. Webb gestured toward Sarah without looking at her directly. "Some people believe that anyone can be a combat instructor, regardless of their natural limitations. They think that lowering our standards is progress." The soldiers remained silent, but Sarah could feel their discomfort. Many of them had trained under her guidance and knew her capabilities firsthand. They had seen her demonstrate techniques that even some of the male instructors struggled with. "Today, we're going to test these modern theories," Webb continued, his voice growing louder. "Instructor Chen will demonstrate her defensive techniques against a real opponent." Sarah's heart began to race. This wasn't part of the scheduled program. She looked toward the other senior officers, but they avoided her gaze. Webb had the authority to modify training exercises as he saw fit. Webb turned to face Sarah directly for the first time. His gray eyes were cold and calculating. "Instructor Chen, please step forward and prepare to demonstrate your defensive skills." Sarah walked to the center of the training area, her mind racing through possible scenarios. She had participated in hundreds of training demonstrations, but something about Webb's tone made this feel different, more personal, more dangerous. "For this demonstration," Webb announced to the watching soldiers, "I will serve as the attacking opponent. This will show you the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application in real combat situations." The training ground fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Sarah realized that Webb intended to humiliate her in front of the entire unit. He probably expected her to back down or ask for a different opponent. But Sarah's father had taught her something important during all those years of training. He said that the moment you show fear to a bully, You give them power over you forever. She had spent too many years building her reputation to let Webb destroy it with one humiliating demonstration. "I'm ready, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her body. Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He began removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. The muscles in his forearms were impressive, built from decades of military training and combat experience. "The scenario is simple," Webb explained to the watching soldiers. "An enemy combatant attempts to strike an officer. The officer must defend themselves, using appropriate force." Sarah took her defensive stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed but ready. She had practiced this position thousands of times, until it became as natural as breathing. Her instructors had taught her to read an opponent's intentions through their posture and movement. Webb positioned himself about 3 feet away from Sarah. She could see the confidence in his stance, the way he held his shoulders. He believed his size and strength would overwhelm her quickly. She had faced this kind of underestimation many times before. "Begin," Webb called out. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the watching soldiers barely saw it. Webb raised his right hand high above his head, preparing to deliver what would have been a devastating blow to Sarah's shoulder or neck area. His intention was clear: to demonstrate that physical strength trumped technique every time. But Sarah had been reading his body language from the moment he took his stance. She saw his weight shift to his back foot, noticed the way his right shoulder lifted slightly before his hand began to move. These tiny tells gave her the split-second advantage she needed. As Webb's hand came down toward her, Sarah stepped forward instead of backward. This unexpected movement put her inside his striking range, where his longer reach became a disadvantage. At the same time, she grabbed his descending wrist with both hands and used his own momentum against him. The technique was called an arm bar, something she had practiced countless times with partners of all sizes. By positioning her body correctly and applying pressure at the right angle, she could control someone much larger than herself. But Webb's aggressive approach and overconfidence caused him to put more force into his attack than either of them expected. When Sarah applied the defensive technique, the combination of his forward momentum and her counter-movement created more stress on his arm than the joint could handle. The sharp crack that echoed across the training ground was unmistakably the sound of breaking bone. The sound of Colonel Webb's arm breaking seemed to hang in the air, like thunder after lightning. For a moment that felt like hours, nobody moved. The 282 soldiers stood frozen in formation, their eyes wide with shock at what they had just witnessed. Sarah released Webb's arm immediately and stepped back, her training taking over. Her first instinct was to help. Despite everything that had just happened, Webb stumbled backward, his face pale with pain and disbelief, cradling his right arm against his chest. "Medic!" Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Several soldiers broke formation and rushed toward them, but Sarah waved them back. "Give him space. Someone radio for medical assistance now." Webb looked at his broken arm, then at Sarah, then at the hundreds of soldiers who had witnessed his humiliation. The proud colonel who had stood tall just moments before now seemed smaller somehow, diminished by pain and shock. You broke my arm," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Sir, you need medical attention," Sarah replied, keeping her voice professional. She wanted to explain that she had only used a standard defensive technique, that his injury was caused by his own aggressive approach, but she knew this wasn't the time for explanations. The base medic arrived within minutes, followed closely by an ambulance. As the medical team worked on stabilizing Webb's arm, Sarah found herself surrounded by curious and concerned faces. Some soldiers looked at her with newfound respect, while others seemed worried about the consequences of what had just happened. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, one of Sarah's closest allies on the base, approached her quietly. "Sarah, you need to prepare for what's coming next. Webb's not going to let this slide, broken arm or not." Sarah nodded, already thinking ahead. She knew that breaking a superior officer's arm, even in a legitimate training exercise, would trigger a formal investigation. Her military career could be over before the day ended. As the ambulance carried Webb away to the base hospital, Major Patricia Williams took charge of the situation. Williams was the second in command at Fort Harrison and had always been fair in her dealings with Sarah. "All soldiers return to your quarters," Williams announced. "Normal training schedules are suspended for the remainder of the day. Instructor Chen, please report to my office immediately." The walk to Major Williams' office felt like the longest journey of Sarah's military career. She replayed the incident over and over in her mind, trying to identify anything she could have done differently. But every time she analyzed the situation, she reached the same conclusion. She had followed her training perfectly. Williams' office was spartanly decorated, with only a few family photos and military commendations on the walls. The major gestured for Sarah to sit across from her desk, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had clearly been brewing for hours. "Tell me exactly what happened out there," Williams said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Sarah recounted the events step by step, from Webb's initial comments about women in combat roles to the moment his arm broke during the demonstration. She spoke clearly and factually, avoiding any emotional commentary about Webb's motivations or behavior. Williams listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Sarah finished her account, the major leaned back in her chair and sighed deeply. "Sarah, you're one of our best instructors. Your students consistently score higher on combat readiness tests than any other unit on this base. But what happened today is going to create serious complications." "I understand, ma'am. I was only following standard defensive protocols. I believe you. And the video cameras we installed on the training ground last month will support your version of events. But Webb has powerful friends in the Pentagon. He's been pushing for months to have women removed from combat instructor positions." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors about Webb's connections, but hadn't realized how extensive they might be. In the military, having enemies in high places could end a career faster than any battlefield injury. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "There will be a formal investigation, probably lasting several weeks. You'll be suspended from instructor duties pending the outcome. Webb will almost certainly press charges, claiming excessive force or assault on a superior officer." The weight of the situation began to settle on Sarah's shoulders. She had worked for 8 years to reach her current position, overcoming obstacles that most of her male colleagues never had to face. Now it might all disappear because she had successfully defended herself against an attack. Over the next few days, news of the incident spread throughout the military community like wildfire. Social media buzzed with debates about women in combat roles, appropriate force in training exercises, and military hierarchy. Some posts supported Sarah, calling her a hero who had stood up to harassment. Others condemned her for attacking a superior officer. The investigation began immediately. Military police interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed security footage, and examined Sarah's training records and psychological evaluations. Every aspect of her military service came under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Webb was recovering in the base hospital with a compound fracture that would require surgery and months of physical therapy. Despite his injury, he made it clear through his lawyers that he intended to pursue maximum penalties against Sarah. The story caught the attention of national media outlets. Television news programs featured debates between military experts arguing about proper training procedures and gender equality in the armed forces. Newspaper editorials either praised Sarah's skills or questioned whether women possessed the judgment necessary for combat instruction. Sarah tried to ignore the media circus and focus on the investigation. She spent hours with military lawyers, reviewing regulations about training exercises and defensive force protocols. The lawyers assured her that the evidence supported her actions, but they also warned that military justice didn't always follow logical conclusions. 3 weeks into the investigation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hayes, one of the highest-ranking women in the military, requested a private meeting. Hayes had built her career during an era when female officers faced even greater challenges than Sarah's generation. "I've reviewed all the evidence from your case," Hayes told Sarah during their meeting. "What happened was unfortunate, but it was also inevitable. Webb has been looking for an excuse to challenge women's roles in combat training for months. "General, I never intended to injure him. I was only defending myself using standard techniques. I know that. But sometimes individual incidents become larger than the people involved in them. Your case is being watched by military leaders around the world. The outcome will influence policies about gender integration in combat roles for years to come." The pressure was enormous. Sarah realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own career anymore. She was fighting for every woman who wanted to serve in combat roles, and every woman who would face similar challenges in the future. As the investigation continued, support for Sarah began to build among enlisted soldiers and junior officers. Many of them had trained under her guidance and knew firsthand that her skills and judgment were exceptional. They started a petition asking for her reinstatement, which eventually gathered over 3,000 signatures. But Webb's allies in the Pentagon were also mobilizing. They argued that allowing Sarah to escape consequences would undermine military discipline and hierarchy. They claimed that soldiers needed to respect their superiors without question, regardless of the circumstances. The investigation stretched into its fourth week, with no clear resolution in sight. The turning point in Sarah's case came from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant James Murphy, a computer specialist who managed the base's security systems, approached the investigation team with crucial evidence that had been overlooked. Murphy had discovered that the training ground's camera system had multiple angles of the incident, including a high-definition close-up camera that captured every detail of the confrontation. More importantly, the system also recorded audio from sensitive microphones placed around the training area. "You need to listen to this," Murphy told the investigating officers as he played back the audio recording. The conversation between Webb and Sarah before the demonstration was crystal clear, including Webb's comments about testing modern theories and his obvious intention to humiliate her in front of the assembled soldiers. But the most damning evidence was what the microphones picked up just before Webb raised his hand to strike. In a voice barely above a whisper, Webb could be heard saying, "Time to teach this girl a lesson she won't forget." The audio recording changed everything. It proved that Webb had planned to use excessive force against Sarah from the beginning. His intention wasn't to conduct a legitimate training exercise but to assault her under the guise of military instruction. When confronted with this evidence, Webb's lawyers quickly shifted their strategy. They argued that their client's comments were taken out of context, and that his injury was still the result of excessive force on Sarah's part. But the military prosecutors saw the situation differently. They realized that charging Sarah would essentially be punishing a soldier for successfully defending herself against an attack by a superior officer. Such a precedent would send a dangerous message throughout the military. General Hayes called Sarah into her office again as the investigation neared its conclusion. The general's expression was serious, but Sarah detected a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "The investigation is complete," Hayes announced. "The audio evidence makes it clear that Colonel Webb initiated an unprovoked attack under the pretext of a training exercise. You responded with appropriate defensive force to protect yourself from harm." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained cautious. Military justice could be unpredictable, and she had learned not to celebrate until the final verdict was announced. "However," Hayes continued, "this incident has created complications that extend beyond your individual case. Webb's actions have raised serious questions about leadership and judgment among senior officers. The Pentagon is conducting a broader review of training protocols and supervisory responsibilities." The official announcement came 2 days later. Sarah was cleared of all charges and reinstated to her position as combat instructor. The investigation report concluded that she had acted appropriately and professionally throughout the incident. But the story didn't end with Sarah's vindication. Colonel Webb faced a military tribunal for assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The audio evidence of his premeditated attack made his defense impossible. Webb was found guilty on all charges. He was stripped of his rank, dismissed from the military without benefits, and sentenced to 6 months in military prison. The tribunal's report noted that his actions had brought discredit to the military and violated the trust placed in senior officers. The incident sparked widespread changes in military training protocols. New regulations required multiple officers to oversee any training exercise involving physical contact between personnel of different ranks. Audio and video recording became mandatory for all combat instruction demonstrations. More significantly, the case became a turning point for women's roles in military combat positions. Sarah's successful defense against Webb's attack demonstrated that female soldiers possessed both the skills and judgment necessary for combat roles. Military leaders around the world cited her case when implementing policies that expanded opportunities for women in their armed forces. Sarah returned to her duties as a combat instructor, but her experience had changed her in subtle ways. She was more aware of the political undercurrents that influenced military decisions, and more determined to mentor other women who wanted to serve in combat roles. The soldiers who witnessed the incident never forgot what they saw that day. Many of them later said it changed their understanding of what strength really meant. They learned that true strength wasn't about size or aggression, but about skill, judgment, and the courage to stand up for what was right. 6 months after the incident, Sarah received a letter from an unexpected source. It came from Colonel Webb, who was nearing the end of his military prison sentence. In the letter, he apologized for his actions and acknowledged that his behavior had been inexcusable. Webb wrote that his time in prison had forced him to confront his prejudices about women in the military. He admitted that his attack on Sarah had been motivated by his fear that traditional military culture was changing in ways he couldn't accept. Sarah read the letter twice before deciding how to respond. She could have ignored it or written an angry reply, detailing the damage his actions had caused to her career and reputation. Instead, she chose a different approach. Her response was brief but gracious. She thanked Webb for his apology and expressed hope that he would use his experience to help other people overcome their own prejudices. She wrote that forgiveness was sometimes the strongest response to hatred. 3 years later, Sarah was promoted to the rank of major and given command of the entire combat training program at Fort Harrison. Under her leadership, the program became a model for military bases around the world, known for its emphasis on skill development rather than physical intimidation. The training ground where the incident occurred was renamed the Sarah Chen Combat Training Center, though Sarah had argued against the honor. A small plaque near the obstacle course commemorated the day when 282 soldiers learned that courage comes in many forms. Webb eventually found work as a civilian contractor, helping to design safety protocols for military training exercises. He never returned to active military service, but his experience led him to become an advocate for preventing harassment in military settings. The story of that day continued to spread throughout military communities worldwide. It became a case study in military academies, used to teach future officers about leadership, prejudice, and the importance of treating all personnel with respect, regardless of gender. Sarah often reflected on how quickly everything had changed. In the space of a few seconds, a routine training demonstration had become a defining moment not just for her career, but for military policy around the world. She realized that sometimes the most important battles are won not through overwhelming force, but through the precise application of skill and the courage to stand firm when others expect you to back down. The 282 soldiers who witnessed Sarah break Colonel Webb's arm carried the memory with them throughout their military careers. They told the story to new recruits, to their families, and to anyone who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. For them, the incident wasn't just about one woman defending herself against an attacker. It was proof that strength comes in many forms, that skill can overcome size, and that standing up for what's right sometimes requires taking risks that others might not understand. The lesson they learned that day stayed with them long after they left the military, influencing how they treated colleagues, how they raised their children, and how they thought about equality and justice in all aspects of their lives. In the end, Colonel Webb's attempt to humiliate Sarah had accomplished exactly the opposite of what he intended. Instead of proving that women didn't belong in combat roles, his attack had demonstrated that they possessed not only the physical skills necessary for military service, but also the judgment and restraint to use those skills appropriately. The sound of that breaking arm had echoed far beyond the training ground at Fort Harrison, becoming a symbol of change that would influence military policies and attitudes for generations to come.